Damian, thank you so much for finding the time to do this.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on it, Nathan. I've been looking forward to it for a while since we originally spoke, so thanks for the invitation.
No worries. I just wanted to start by asking you the question which we kick off all our episodes with, and that is, what's the wrong you want to right?
It's a brilliant question. I think the wrong that I would like to right is getting people to understand how powerful culture can be and how it can be used as a competitive advantage within whatever world that we operate in. So the phrase culture is quite an abstract term. If you go and ask 100 people what their definition of culture is, you'll get 100 different responses to it. So I'm really passionate about helping establish a common language for what culture is, and a more helpful question is, what type of culture do you have? But then more importantly, about how can you then harness the power of culture to your advantage so that you create an environment where people can perform to their potential, where they can flourish and blossom, and then deliver exceptional results in whatever industry it is that you're working in or that you're operating in.
Really interesting. Very well put. And I guess you've been working in this space for a long time. I guess for the context for listeners, can you explain what your role is as a professor, and I guess what that means in a sort of academic sense, but then also in a professional environment as well?
Yeah. So I'm a visiting professor now at Manchester Met University, but my background is in organisational psychology and change. So it's very much around looking at how do you create high performing teams and in particular the cultures that underpin them. And then just as importantly, how do you develop them to be strong enough and robust enough that they can adapt and respond to the changes that happen around them. So what I also do is I work across a wide range of organisations, from business through to education, through to elite sport, working with teams and more personally the leaders of those teams to help them understand the power of it and then harness it. And then the third job I do is I've been lucky enough to write a few different books around these topics where I've been able to go into some quite interesting worlds and find some quite interesting stories that help just to illustrate and accentuate the messages as well.
And I mean, I discovered you and we discovered you as part of the book club community through your most recent book, The Barcelona Way.
Yeah.
Which I read over Christmas. Fantastic read.
Thank you.
It was almost a nice time to read it as well, because it was kind of a nice break from work to kind of reflect on where we'd got to and reflect on what was kind of coming up. And I kind of want to dive into various different ideas from that book throughout the episode. Sure. I guess first of all there, and I guess another important piece of context which I've heard you speak about before, is how should we understand the world of sport versus the world of business? Where should we draw parallels and where shouldn't we maybe draw parallels?
It's a brilliant question, Nathan. I urge anybody listening to this podcast or anyone that is taking these ideas outside into the wider world, be very, very careful of anyone that comes along and labours the metaphor of sport and business. It's an easily done metaphor where you talk about working together for a common goal and things like that. But I think be careful of it, because I think the metaphor is disingenuous for two reasons. I think there's two huge areas where sport and business don't align. The first one is I've seen some of the kind of conduct and behaviours that happen within a sporting environment are just completely abnormal from what the corporate world would allow. What do I mean by that? Well, some of the sort of the jokey nature of it, but I've seen sort of bullying happen, but can be legitimised as part of the physical nature of a sport. So if you wanted to smash somebody to make a point in training, you will have the opportunity to do that and it would look legitimate, even though you know why it would happen. So there's behaviours like that that just are unacceptable, quite rightly, in the corporate world. And the second thing as well is the punitive nature of sport means that you have access to those tools a lot more readily. You can drop a player from a game, which feels like a punishment. You can sell somebody. You can terminate their contract at the end of a season and things like that. Now, employment law doesn't allow us to do that. So in the corporate world, you might be working with difficult characters, but they might have been there a long time and they have the protection of employment law quite rightly. That means that you can't just get rid of them in the same way. So I think those two differences mean that the metaphor of sport and business often falls down. Where I think there are an awful lot of parallels, though, saying that, is around the people element. So, say, for example, with the Barcelona book, when people said, I don't like football, they say, no, that's fine, but it's not a football book, it's a book about people, that just in this case happen to work within football. And it's the people element that I think is a rich area for us to try and understand in terms of engagement, teaching skills of coping under pressure. How do you develop an organisation where people can flourish yet still work within frameworks? All of that kind of stuff is common to sport, business and education.
And I guess in the early part of the book, before you focus in on the commitment culture, which you argue is the sort of most powerful form of culture, you kind of outline a few different other modes of culture as well, a star model, an engineering model.
That's right, yeah.
Could you give a sort of explanation around what those are? And I guess it'll be interesting for people to try and reflect on where their company fits on that spectrum.
Yeah, so it's research. So in the world of organisational psychology, the culture is one of the, or has been traditionally one of the great under-researched areas in many ways. And there was a couple of guys from Stanford University called Barron and Hannon that used to lecture that culture could be a competitive advantage when people said, where's the evidence? The reality was that there was relatively little. So these two guys in the early 1990s went into Silicon Valley, and given the close proximity to Stanford, it made sense. But there was also, it was almost like it was a perfect environment to test these theories out, because there was a whole heap of startup businesses and things like that were grateful for the research interest. And what they went and looked at was these startup businesses in terms of what type of culture emerged when people just allowed it to happen organically. What happened? And what was initially intended to be a 2-year study ended up lasting for nearly 25 years as they tracked these different businesses. And what they found was, traditionally, there are 5 cultures that tend to emerge if you just allow this to happen organically. So the first type of culture is a star model. And this is where you basically have a team that goes out of its way to recruit the most talented people they can afford. They pay them the highest salaries they can. They give them the finest facilities. And then you almost just sit back and wait for all that talent in the room to come together and deliver phenomenal results. So in the research, Google is an outlier for an organisation that does this, because when it goes well, what the evidence says is it'll go spectacularly well. But what it blinds us to is when it goes wrong, it'll go badly wrong.
So Google are an anomaly in that respect.
In many ways. And then, but what's interesting is that Google, because they've been so phenomenally successful, have also got phenomenal budgets for PR. So they're constantly telling you how good they are. So we have this image in our head of, we put beanbags in the office, we have slides, we have free canteen facilities, and we get caught up in the narrative of why they do it. And it's not to say those elements are not important or don't work, but when we go after a star culture, it's that boom or bust. That if it works, it will work. Now, part of the reason we chose Barcelona as a model to go and look at in terms of culture was, a big reason is because there's lots of comparable teams competing in the same industry as them.
Yeah. So
Real Madrid offer you a textbook example of a star model. So since 2003, they've had a president in place called Florentino Perez that adopted what we know today as their Galactico model, which is about recruiting the world's best players. And I think they offer you a great example that they've won 3 consecutive Champions Leagues, which hasn't been done in that industry for a long time. But they've not won the league more than 3 times in the last 15 years either, which is also the longest barren period. And there was a great quote from one of the coaches at Real Madrid called Diego Lopez that said, the trouble with the star culture is everyone wants to be the head waiter, but nobody wants to wash the dishes.
Yeah.
And it's that idea of it's often the back of house stuff that'll derail you. So that's the first type of culture that listeners might identify with.
Yeah.
The second type of culture you get is an autocracy. And this is where, in the Barron and Hannon research, this is where it was often, they cited like a charismatic founder of a business, or it might be a powerful chief exec. And it tends to be that they almost run it as a fiefdom. It's my way or the highway. So they dictate the culture, and their whims and peccadillos come to the fore.
Yeah.
So a great example of that would be, if you think about Apple under the first incarnation of Steve Jobs. So him and Steve Wozniak, when they founded it, they built the business up. And then when he was kicked off the board in the 90s, the share price fell off a cliff because the vacuum that was left behind led to a whole heap of confusion and dysfunction.
Yeah, everyone was just bought into his vision.
Very much. And then when he came back, he reignited and brought that sort of laser-like focus to it. Again, football offers you a great example. You think of like some of the oligarchs like Roman Abramovich that bought Chelsea. You think of Manchester United under Alex Ferguson. And since he retired in 2013, the vacuum left by his absence has been pretty stark in terms of the dysfunction that's followed. The third type of culture you get is a bureaucracy, and this is where it's about middle managers running the show. So this is where there's like a thick level of managers that rule the roost by policies, procedures, rules and regulations. When you make a decision, you tend to do it by committee and consensus. Rather than doing the right thing, you do the thing that's right for most people. And what the evidence says in bureaucratic cultures is change happens, but it tends to be slow, ponderous, and quite reactive as opposed to proactive.
Okay.
The fourth type of culture is an engineering culture. And an engineering culture isn't about engineering per se. It's about when you bring in people that have got a technical expertise in a topic. So you bring in somebody that might be a subject matter expert. And then you add all those pieces up, and you hope the cumulative effect is greater than the parts. The flaw with cultures like this, though, is that you often get people creating their own little fiefdoms, where you get a lot of silo mentality, people defending their knowledge base and not necessarily respecting knowledge of others as well. So that can feel quite a silo culture. The final culture that we're going to discuss here, though, is a commitment culture. And a commitment culture is an organisation or a team that has a really clear, compelling sense of purpose. Why do we exist? It defines success on its own terms, in terms of what success looks like, and then they have a really clear set of behaviours that underpin this is how people are expected to conduct themselves. Now, what was interesting in Barron and Hannon's research on this was that one of the first appointments of organisations that pursued a commitment culture was an HR department.
Right.
So it was about putting people very much at the heart of their decision making. Now, what was fascinating was over the 25 years they tracked this, what they found is that on most of the big measures like speed to market, market share, profitability, turnover, all the things that we consider important for a business, commitment cultures tended on average to outperform those other four types by around 22%. There was some other research done by a guy called Paul Zak that suggested in commitment cultures where there's high levels of trust that are created, people stay loyal to commitment cultures even when they're offered pay rises of around 36% to go somewhere else.
So the benefits are potentially huge.
Massive. And the way I often try and explain it to people when we get into this discussion of it is to say, think of a commitment culture as that intersection where doing good and actually being good meet in the middle. And as you say, Nick, that the positive effects of this, of investing in culture, are huge.
And is it the case that you could sort of pick elements from some of those models and elements from others, or is that a dangerous game to play?
No, I don't think it is. I think what you'll find is that in lots of organisations there'll be pockets of different types of cultures, but there will always be one overriding culture that will dominate. There has to be. And until that can happen, what you sometimes get is if you've got different pockets of culture, they clash. So you'll get a lot of internal politicking, you'll get a lot of misunderstandings, you'll get a lot of sort of dissatisfaction until one culture will override. And that's where if that's where I think the conversation is far better suited. So rather than somebody saying we've got a good culture, a bad culture, a toxic culture, a high-performing culture, let's get rid of some of these phrases and start talking about we have a commitment culture, we have a autocratic culture, and whatever it is, we have a clear understanding of it. It means that we have a very different and far more productive conversation.
That plays into the word itself, right? The word commitment is almost like you've got to take that step and go, we're going in this direction because we believe it's the right thing to do.
Bingo. That's a really astute point, Dave, because the etymology of the word commitment, if you look at it, it implies choice. You don't sleepwalk into a commitment culture. You don't find yourself there by accident wondering what happened. You've made a very deliberate choice that you want to be a part of something. And that's why I think when you decide that that's what you're going to go after, the obligation on leaders that decide that this is the route they're going to pursue has to be you need to remove ambiguity from people. If you're going to ask people to make a choice, your job is to be really clear as to what you're asking them to sign up to. And that's where having those clear sense of behaviours, if you come in here, this is what we expect of you. You allow people to make a choice with their eyes wide open rather than it becoming subjective or reactive.
And when it comes to the behaviours then, I find this quite interesting because I think like when you look at the sort of typical business world, businesses tend to be very good at saying this is our vision, this is our mission, these are our values. And it seems like often they fall a step short of saying, well, this is how we actually deliver on those values, these are our behaviours. But maybe the sporting world is almost, the mission at least is probably very clear, but the behaviours are something which are like daily
kind
things,
of, yeah, but I think, again, it's a really interesting observation that I think what the language... So some people would argue this is just semantics. I'd say, well, it's not, because I think when you talk about values, for example, when we say, what are our organisational values? Values, by its definition, is an abstract term. Values are deep, personal and intrinsic to us. They're relevant to us, and they've been established and inculcated in us through our family, our experiences, our schools, our life before we join a business.
Yeah,
that's where your values come from. So when you hear an organisation come up with some bland abstract values like, oh, we value integrity, you go, well, who's arguing for the opposite? If you think of what the opposite is of being two-faced or disingenuous, you go, well, who's arguing for that? So arguing about behaving with integrity is almost self-evident. But the bit that where the danger of stopping your thinking by going, oh yeah, we've got a value now of integrity is how does that translate into action? Because your behaviours should be your values in action. How you behave should be a representation of what your values are. But if you only say, oh, we insist on having the value of integrity, the only obligation of anyone in your business has to be is to nod and go, yeah, I feel the same way. But a behaviour says, prove it.
Yeah.
Now demonstrate it. Now demonstrate that you behave with integrity. Go and tell that client that you're going to overspend. Go and explain to your colleagues why they're not going to get a budget and a bonus this year. Go and do that, because that would demonstrate integrity in action.
Yeah, completely.
And that's why I think in commitment cultures, you need to go to that next step that says, this is how you're expected to behave, and this isn't going to be compromised.
And I guess before you could get to those behaviours, the first part of the Barca acronym that you use in the book is the big picture. How should an organisation try and, if they don't already know the big picture, try and identify what the big picture should be for their organisation or for their team, perhaps? Well,
the big picture is the why, the what, and the how. So this is you need to be able to answer all of these questions. So why do you exist? And what I've tried to do there is so at Barcelona, they've got a geopolitical context. They believe that Catalonia was subjugated by wider Spain. They lost their independence in 1719. So it's not without coincidence that in the 17th minute and 19th second of every game they play at home, the fans rise and chant for Catalan independence. So their sense of purpose, they often refer to themselves as the Army of Catalonia, is pretty well established. Now, for those businesses or owners that are listening to this and go, well, we don't have that same sense of geopolitical issues that we could rail against. I think there's ways in which you can do it. You can talk about what impact do you make on people's lives. So there's kind of universalization. What is the quality of your product that you do? What difference do you make to your industry? What are the values that you want to espouse that nobody else is doing? There's still a way you can just articulate, well, why do you exist? If you didn't exist, what would be the purpose of it?
Yeah.
It's like Jim Collins in the Good to Great stuff is a good example of it. He says, what's your core? And your strategy is your manifestation of that. So the example he uses in Good to Great is, he says, if you think of Nokia started life as a paper mill in Finland, and then they went through a whole heap of different variations of making telephone wires before they eventually settled on the mobile phone industry. But the Nokia core is, if you remember the old Nokia phone when you used to turn it on and it was those hands together, it was connecting people. So if you look at what Nokia have done since when people connected writing letters, they were a paper mill. Then when it was the telephone, they were making the telephone wires. Then when mobile technology came in, they were still connecting people. That sense of purpose runs throughout everything that they do.
So having that big picture can open you up to a bigger future almost, rather than being something which defines a set path.
Yeah, very much. So then if your industry... So I remember talking to a friend of mine that he was in a retail jewellers, but he said, I'm not in the jewellery business, I'm in the business of enriching people's lives. And his point was, if the retail jewellery business went under tomorrow, he said, I'd open an old person's home, or I'd go and dig wells in Africa. I'd still go and enrich people's lives. I'd just find a different strategy to execute my purpose. The bit that underpins that is the what. Well, what does success mean for you?
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting in our world here is that we often define success in really tangible terms. It's always about how much money do you make, what's your profit, what's your turnover. And whilst that's important, this isn't to discount it. Again, I'd go back to Jim Collins' stuff. He says, we need to get away from this either or. We either make a difference or we make a profit. And we instead get into the both and.
Yeah.
We can we can both make a difference and make a profit as well. So this was what at Barcelona, again, it was interesting because they defined themselves in terms of trophies won and things like that. And in the 1970s, they brought in a Dutch footballer called Johan Cruyff, who was a real maverick thinker, but he was regarded as the best in the world, so he was credible as well. And when he arrived, he very quickly diagnosed Barcelona was suffering from a condition he described as Madriditis. He said, you're constantly measuring yourself against your biggest rivals, and anything they do, you react. And his point was a simple but powerful one. He said, you can't be successful if you have the mentality of a victim. Define success on your terms, not on anyone else's.
Yeah.
Which is why Barcelona are defined by this idea of we play stylish, attacking football with a flair and a panache, and win trophies as well.
Yeah.
So what's really good about them is, or what's interesting about them is, just even recently, they sacked their head coach, a guy called Ernesto Valverde, who, by any definition, he's won their league and a cup in the 2 seasons that he's been in charge. But he's not played it with the style and the flair that they expected. So they've got rid of him to bring in somebody that can both deliver the success and the trophy and do it in a style as well.
I mean, it's interesting that you say, obviously, you think about Barcelona now and you default to thinking, amazing, successful club, but it's not always been the case. And you kind of talk about in the book how you describe that, the arc of change, that things aren't, it's not a route of A to B, of becoming successful. And I guess, what's your take on how do you identify where you are on that arc of change, perhaps, and how do you adapt to those different situations?
Well, the arc of change is a quote that it really resonated with me. I read it from Martin Luther King, and he was talking about the civil rights movement, of course, but he was talking about the arc of change follows a true path. It's a consistent path, but it might sometimes feel long and confusing, but it will still follow that same path. Mm-hmm. So it's worth it just understanding, well, what is it? And it was Joseph Campbell, who was a famous sociologist, and in the early part of the 20th century, he went around some of the most...
It's all right, no, it's fine.
He went around some of the most diverse cultures in the world, asking the question, what unites us rather than what divides us?
Yeah.
And what he came across was that one of the common understandings of all humanity is the pattern of change, which Martin Luther King described as the arc of change. Now, most people haven't heard of Joseph Campbell. He produced a seminal book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was his response to this. But most people have heard of his most famous student's work, George Lucas.
Yeah.
So George Lucas took Campbell's work, and its obvious manifestation is in Star Wars, and part of the universal success of Star Wars is the arc of change. So the reason I mention that is it sometimes just helps people to demystify what we're talking about. Okay. And there's 5 stages of change. The first stage of change is the dream bit. This is where we get everyone fired up and excited, or at the start of the business we get excited about how amazing things are going to be. The leap stage is that commitment, that move towards a commitment that says, now I'm going to do something different tomorrow than what I did today.
Yeah.
Then we meet the messy middle. This is the fight stage. And the fight stage is the bit where everything starts to go wrong. In psychological literature, there's a lady called Rosabeth Kanter. She's a Harvard psychologist. She has a law named after her, Kanter's Law. And it says when you're in the middle of any project, it will always look and feel like a failure. Because the middle bit is where you're too far to go back, but you're not far enough to get to the end. So morale declines, despondency sets in. Now, traditionally in most football clubs, Nathan, that's where they sack the head coach. And they go back to the start, and they can stay in those first 3 stages for decades.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of clubs get stuck just in the messy middle.
Very much. So then when things go wrong, sack the coach, bring somebody else in, it gets you all excited, and they'll hit the same cultural problems themselves. So you sack them and bring somebody else in. You need to get through the messy middle. When you get through that, you'll see seeds of progress, which is the 4th stage of change, where progress starts to happen. It'll only be small and it'll be fleeting, but you have to spot them. And then once you build on that momentum, you'll get to the arrival stage and the process starts again. So when we understand that those 5 stages are consistent in any change that we do, we say, first of all, that's a helpful guide. It's like a map to understand where we are at any stage. But there's a really interesting exercise you can do there's a psychologist called Gary Klein suggests this. He calls it the pre-mortem. So before you set off on your journey, conduct a pre-mortem, and a pre-mortem says, what could kill this initiative?
Yeah.
What's all the problems that we're likely to face? And if you take the time to invest in answering those questions, what the evidence suggests is you improve resilience when you hit the messy middle by about 30%. Because if you know the problems are going to come, you've anticipated some of them, you welcome them as a sign of progress rather than see them as a warning sign that things are going wrong.
And there's a couple of interesting bits in this for me. One of which you talk about in the book is like the storytelling that becomes really important when you think about this. Yeah. And that I guess leaders in particular being able to draw people back to, as you say, the big picture, but the journey that they're on. And I think there's some great stories in the book about how the stories that Pep Guardiola used to retell, for example, to his team just to reinforce that they're on a journey.
So the lady called Nancy Duarte talks about this in terms of, she talks about the different symbols of storytelling. You can have ceremonies. It might be like a Friday night's drink, something like that, that's the end of a tough week, or dress down Friday, things like that. You have symbols that indicate where you are at any stage, as just some of the factors. But storytelling is a really powerful skill for leaders. So the example I use in the book is that Pep Guardiola brought in a guy that had survived so if you remember the film Alive, about the
plane crash.
Yeah, the plane crash. I think it was the Argentinian team that crashed into a mountain, and they survived the crash and all came out of it. And Guardiola brought in one of the survivors from that to come and talk to the players and just tell his story. And part of the reason he'd done it was that they then had a metaphor for the arc of change. So this guy was telling them about the despondency and how at one stage it was just about putting one foot in front of the other to go and search for help and things like that. So he was using examples from outside his football club to illustrate everybody goes through this. We're now going to set off on this journey. So let's prepare ourselves for that messy middle bit and give people the sense of it. So storytelling is one of the great underrated virtues of leaders that want to create a culture. Stories are like where you find examples of people demonstrating the behaviours you want, and you make heroes of those people. You celebrate them. You know, many years ago I went into Southwest Airlines in Baltimore, and what was really interesting there is they're often cited as a great example of an organisational culture that just allows people to thrive. And on their walls they had a really interesting concept called an eat crow wall. Now that's an American phrase, I hadn't heard it before, but eat crow means it's like a cock up or a mistake.
Okay.
And they had a wall dedicated to cock ups that their staff had made.
Right, interesting.
Which was interesting. And when I said to them, why do you have that? They said, well, one of our key behaviours is we ask people to solve problems. We say to people, use your initiative and solve problems. If you see a problem on the job, just deal with it there and then. Don't scale it up to your boss. Just tackle it if you can. And they said, so if we're asking people to solve problems, what we have to accept is sometimes they get it wrong. So how we deal with the failure of them taking the initiative themselves is key. So if we hammer somebody or we bury that mistake that they've made, what we do is we create a culture of fear. So nobody will ever make a mistake again, but equally they'll never take a risk either.
It's quite interesting.
To solve a problem. Whereas if we make heroes of them and celebrate the mistakes in a way that isn't making fun of people, it makes them realise you did the right, your intent was right, the execution was wrong, but that's fine. You create an environment where people feel safe enough to go, oh, I'll try it then.
It's quite interesting because someone a while ago created a good work channel in our Slack, our company Slack, where people can celebrate each other for doing good work. And it was really interesting, lots of good stories. Then someone created a shit work channel as well, which was like, this is about sharing when something you've done hasn't gone right, or when you've made a mistake, when you've cocked up, I guess in a similar way, because it's like there's a lot to learn by looking at those things, but then it's also a case of encouraging people to actually be pushing themselves, and it's okay not to
it's brilliant. I had a mate who was a teacher, and when he got into sort of his first leadership thing, when he used to have departments, I used to say, make it a bit of fun, but have the mistake club. So in one of your team meetings, have a session called the mistake club where you talk about your cock-ups that week. And he was like, what do you do that for? I said, well, because what you're doing is, if you can take the lead with that, it creates a sense of safety where people go, oh, I had that as well. So you help to solve a problem, but equally you create a culture of psychological safety where you're not afraid of making a mistake. You're not worried about the consequences of getting laughed at or lambasted or punished, because your intent was right, the execution didn't go as well. So mistake clubs or shit work channels, however you want to do it, or eat crow walls, are powerful ways of telling stories. So it's not just the successes, it's the things that didn't go well and why didn't they go well.
And you frame this in your book when you talk about how to identify the behaviours. You mention an idea of analysing when you've done a good job, when are we good? And could you talk a little bit around that and how you
so that? I dubbed this exercise that I do with teams, success leaves clues. And the reason I talk about that is that what this helps us avoid is gimmickry. So one of the big things for people that want to sort of invest time in culture is don't copy. And what I mean by don't copy is, I hear lots of people say, like, use sport as an example. So the New Zealand Rugby Union team are a great example where they famously sweep their dressing rooms after every game. And I've gone into so many teams that they go, oh, we sweep our dressing rooms after the game. And you go, why? And you say, well, New Zealand do it. And you go, yeah, I know they do it, and I know why they do it. I'm asking, why do you do it? And if your only explanation is because New Zealand do, you're copying. You've got a gimmick, and gimmicks don't work. People see through them. New Zealand do it because it enforces a behaviour of respect for their environment and for each other. So I get that. They've got a clear line of sight of why they do it. So you avoid gimmickry, and that's where I think the exercise of success leaves clues allows us to avoid that. So the question I like to get people to ask is, when you're good, why are you good? Tell me. So think of examples where it might be your best ever client meeting, it might be your best quarter's results, it might be the best project you've ever delivered. It doesn't matter what the area of success is. Let's just go to success and find out, and let's do a proper deep dive analysis as to why are you good. Now, there's a couple of reasons why Success Leaves Clues is a nice place to start on this cultural journey. First of all, who doesn't want to talk about success? Who doesn't want to sort of shine a light on that and feel a bit better for it? And then secondly, it's inclusive. So everybody has got an opinion on it. So when you start to do that, what will emerge in answering the question is, beyond technical skills, it will then start to become behavioural led. People say, oh, we were enthusiastic, we were passionate, we were really responsive, we really listened. Whatever the behaviours are, you will start to distill some consistently present behaviours from that successful occasion. These start to become your trademark behaviours. Because if you can identify what they're like, what that allows you to do is, every team is going to have a bad day. Every team's going to make mistakes. Every team is going to fall occasionally. The difference between a good team and a great team is, good teams can fix it a lot quicker. What bad teams do is they immediately blame external factors. So when they have a bad day, they go in sports, they'll go, oh, the referee was no good, the conditions were no good, the crowd was against us. They make up external factors. What great teams can do is when they underperform, they go, we weren't quick enough, we weren't intense enough, our focus wasn't, and it's all internal behaviours.
It becomes a method of diagnosis, essentially.
Well, it allows you to correct it a lot quicker and therefore do it. So, but you can only diagnose it by analysing what your success looks like in the first place.
And what advice would you give to someone who's kind of doing... Can anyone take on that mantle of being like, I'm going to try and identify when we're good? What advice would you give to someone who kind of thinks it's an important thing for their company to do, but they'd be like, where do I start? Is it my job to do it?
It's everybody's job. It's everybody's job to influence a culture, because we all play our part in doing it. So if there's anyone listening to this that thinks, oh, I'm not sure I have the authority or the remit to do it, I think the Success Leaves Clues is a really good place to jump into it, where you just say, can we just do an analysis of what we're like when we're good? So that way you can almost codify it. So then when it comes to about recruiting other people or inducting people, or when it comes to rewarding and recognising people, you're doing it through the behaviours that everybody's played their part in identifying are present when success is happening.
When it comes to people then, probably one of my favourite parts of the book is around cultural architects.
Yeah.
Can you define a cultural architect?
Yeah, well, the phrase comes from a famous Norwegian psychologist called Willy Raylo. He's passed away now, but he was a guy that talks about cultural architects. These are the people, they're leaders without authority. These are the people that when they speak, people listen. Now, traditionally, a cultural architect, so they don't necessarily have the title of being a leader, but people do look up to them.
Yeah.
And the traditional criteria for the emergence of a cultural architect is one or two. The first way they emerge is often technical. So they're just really good at their job. They just really know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
They might have been around a long time, or they're just skilled at it. So when they speak, people tend to pay deference to them. The second criteria that emerges is sometimes they're socially gregarious. So when they speak, people just really like them and warm to them, or are attracted to them as people. So they tend to be one of the two criteria that emerge. Now, the key for a cultural architect is, do they then demonstrate and defend and role model the trademark behaviours? Because if they do, they become architects, because they can role model, and if they see other people not demonstrating, they can challenge, they can just pull them into line, and they have the credibility where they get listened to and people adhere to it. If they don't, you've got cultural assassins on your hands.
Right.
So if they go against it, but they have that charisma or that power, they can undermine a culture.
And how much of it is nature versus nurture then, something like a cultural architect? Is it that some people potentially, as you say, if they're just naturally gregarious, they're going to naturally fall into that kind of position? Or can you coach cultural architects out of a team?
Yeah, you can definitely coach them. So the nature-nurture debate's a really interesting area to get into, but I think it's one of the great unanswered questions of psychology: how much is nature and how much is nurture? And the reality is nobody knows. The debate tends to range between 10 and 40% of our behaviour is natural to us as part of our what we would class as personality.
Yeah.
But what nobody is disputing is the vast majority of our behaviours are learned behaviours. So by definition, if you've learnt them, you can unlearn them. Right. So this is where this leads us into my answer to a question of it can be coached, because if you set the rules of the game up, which are around behaviours, everyone can demonstrate behaviours. So I'll give you an example. I did some work a few years ago with a Premier League team, and if you'd have looked at it as an outsider, David, and said, right, who are your cultural architects here? There were some very evident ones. I'd say if you, in a dressing room like that, you need at least 5.
Right.
And there was 3 very evident characters that were larger than life, charismatic people that bought into the behaviours. There was another guy that was technically very good, wasn't as maybe charismatic, but he bought into the behaviours. He became the 4th one. The 5th one was an outlier completely. So he was a guy that was very much perceived as an outsider. But when we laid the lens of behaviours over it, he became one of the standout characters.
Right.
And when I asked one of his teammates, because it was a real surprise, his answer was really telling. He said, you didn't ask whether I liked him. You asked whether he demonstrated the behaviours. So behaviours suddenly brought a greater clarity to it. This was a guy that was sort of, the 3 behaviours in this particular team, they were looking at sensible hard work, they were looking at somebody that was a real team player and somebody that was resilient. And this guy was all of those things. Socially, he was a bit clumsy and clueless, but he demonstrated those behaviours in real stark terms. So I think if you were looking at developing cultural architects, a nice exercise that I do if you're going into a situation where the pressure is on and you need to find them quickly, first of all, you've got the behaviours in play. Get people to vote. Just do a private vote. Give in say a sports team, what I would do is give the whole squad 2 votes each to say, tell me who are your 2 standout characters that demonstrate these behaviours. And that's where it becomes really interesting. People will tell you, and it'll often be completely, or not completely, but it can occasionally surprise you as to who these architects really are.
And I guess if you've defined those behaviours, that then lets people see leadership in a different way than not just the default, oh, they're the leader because they speak the loudest or 100%. They have the most friends. It starts to put a different framework around it, that it's like, oh, our leaders are the ones who actually deliver on what we believe in.
Yeah, exactly. So you get away from this idea of the alpha is somebody that speaks loudest or delivering Churchillian speeches or they're doing great symbolic gestures. This is the quiet. This also allows room for the alternative, like you say, the quiet guy, the guy that just leads by example, the guy that's coaching in the shadows. That's where you get a very different definition of leader that starts to emerge in something like this. And this is where, like, another thing that it allows you to do as well is that for the cultural architects then, when you give them permission to do it, a big thing that you're saying is you're not getting into personality clashes here. You're not attacking somebody for the person they are. You can address them for the behaviours that they're demonstrating. So this particular team, this Premier League team I was describing to you, they had a great phrase. They said, you can behave like a dickhead without being one. Because you can change your behaviour. I don't think you're a dickhead, but I think the way you've just behaved is dickhead-ish. And you can stop behaving like that, but you can't change who you are. And that allowed really productive feedback conversations to take place within their world, because it was never about attacking the person.
Name calling,
it was about the behaviours.
And when it comes to recruitment then, you used the example of Zlatan Ibrahimovic in the book.
Yeah.
How can you try and use that, use those behaviours and use that idea of cultural architects to make sure that you bring the right people into a team? It's obviously can't always get it right, but there must be a way of getting it right, more right than wrong.
Yeah, so there's a lovely phrase that they used at Barcelona. There was a man called Jake Humphrey who was the director of football. He's now at Manchester City doing the same job. But his phrase that he gave me was, talent will get you into the room, your behaviour will decide if we keep you there or not. So I love that quote in a cultural context, because what he's suggesting is talent is important. You've got to be able to do the job. You've got to have a level of competency and expertise in the first place. So if you're recruiting somebody, the obvious thing, first of all, is to go after, can they do the job that you're asking them to do? Once you've established that that's the case, that's where the behaviours become really key.
And so I guess it's at a point like that where people probably do look to the leadership of their team or their organisation to be like, well, are those people going to make a tough decision here to align to what they've been saying all along and call it out?
Very much. But then that taps in, Nathan, to this idea of one of the other pillars of a commitment culture is the role of authentic leadership. This is where your leaders then start to role model what they're asking everyone else to do. Now, Warren Buffett gives some really good advice here. So the investor from the Berkshire Hathaway Group, he says, in a culture, a leader should be assessed on 3 criteria if they're going to really maximise their impact. First of all, they have to have the energy for the task to lead the culture. The second one is they have to be intelligent enough on the job that they're doing, so that when they speak, they have credibility.
Yeah.
Now, Buffett's advice is if you only see intelligence and energy, don't hire them, because they could be corrosive, they could be assassins to your culture. The third non-negotiable factor that he insists you recruit for is integrity. Do you demonstrate the behaviours?
Yeah.
Because nobody follows a hypocrite. Your point is right about if you're in a culture and you see somebody getting away with acting against the behaviours and the bosses turn a blind eye to it, the message is, well, you're a hypocrite. You're not prepared to do what you're asking everyone else to demonstrate.
Yeah.
And nobody follows hypocrites. So that's why it becomes essential that the leadership buy into this and demonstrate and role model the behaviours themselves.
And when it comes to sort of leadership and longevity, one of my colleagues asked me to put this question to you. And it's about, once you've got this high performance culture, if that's you've developed this commitment culture, what's your take on how long-standing those things can be? It feels like when you look in the sporting world, for example, you might see a period of sort of 5 to 10 years, and then things will take a turn, and it might return farther down the line.
Sure.
And I guess the same goes for a lot of businesses. You will see some amazing growth and maturity, but then something else might happen, an acquisition, or it'll take a turn. What's your take on sort of longevity of this type of culture?
I think the arc of change helps to answer that question, because on the 5 stages we spoke about, the final stage was the arrival bit where you feel the culture is established. But that's not the end of the journey. That's just the end of that stage of the journey. So this isn't just a one-hit wonder. This is something that needs to be constantly assessed and monitored. And those behaviours might change over time. That sense of purpose might start to adapt. So think of the core versus the strategy. You might have to take a different strategy to execute what the core is. So that might change on a frequent basis, and that's where culture needs to run alongside this and be focused. It can't just be relegated to any other business part of the meeting, or it can't be something that you address in a once-a-year conference and then hope that people remember it. So the longevity of it is a really important piece, but however long you're in business, culture should be running alongside your business strategy at the same time.
Do you have any take on the technology which companies can use to monitor cultural employee engagement at the moment? Do you think there's value in that type of stuff?
Definitely. I like to quote about the role of technology, but it might sound a bit of an unusual, incongruous source, but I remember reading some research years ago about road safety compliance, right? And what they were looking at was, how do you get people, wherever they are in the world, to stick to the speed limit of the road they're driving on? And what they looked at was, do getting police officers out there catching people out work? Not really. Do getting speed cameras out and issuing fines work? Not particularly effectively. Mm-hmm. The most effective way that works is radar displays. So what they know is that when you drive through a radar display that flashes your speed up, and if you can associate it with a smiley or a sad face that indicates whether you're on target or not.
Yeah.
What they know is people stick to the speed limit of the road they're on for about 7.2 miles longer than any other method. And the reason it works is because you're experiencing what Albert Bandura, the psychologist, described as a feedback loop.
Yeah.
You're getting independent evidence that's directly relevant to the task that you're doing, that comes with a really clear consequence, hence the happy or smiley face, and therefore it gives you the opportunity to get out of autopilot mode and focus on your behaviours. So I think if you can use technology to create feedback loops that fit those 4 criteria, are you giving me evidence that's directly relevant to my task or my behaviour? Does it carry with it a consequence, good and bad? And therefore, does it give me the opportunity to change behaviour? I think it's really powerful. So when you get organisations that do like a biannual employee engagement score, that's a waste of time because it gives you a picture of one day in a 2-year period.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take into account the fact that the week before you might have made a slew of redundancies. You might have just had some bad news that have come through, so people's response on that one day they fill it in might not be an accurate reflection of what the wider culture is like.
Yeah.
So if you can build in feedback loops that constantly giving you evidence that's relevant, that has to be powerful for a culture.
Yeah, I agree. No, that's really interesting. I just want to sort of head towards the end with just asking you about, I know you've obviously worked with a lot of sports teams, but you've also consulted for various different businesses.
Yeah.
What kind of questions do businesses tend to come to you with when they're looking for your advice on culture? And do they tend to come to you when culture is already a focus for them, or do they often come to you when they feel like they're in a cultural crisis? Or
yeah, it's a brilliant question. I wouldn't say there's one typical question that gets asked, but there are a number of patterns that you see, and some of it's frustrating. Some of them come when they're in crisis. So they often come and want to focus on this when things go wrong. And again, that's frustrating because you go, and whilst I'm happy to do that and help them because I understand it can often feel quite urgent, this is where if you get this on the agenda early enough, you can often anticipate some of those problems a lot quicker. Another time you often get is that people want to focus on it, but again, I'm really wary about people that want to do it as a one-off hit, or they're doing it as a gimmick because they think it's tick box. It sounds like it's something we should be focused on. This is the on vogue topic at the moment. Things like that are often make me quite sceptical because you're going, if you're not serious about committing some genuine time, energy and investment behind it, save it. Don't do it now. It might not be relevant now for lots of good reasons, but don't do it because you think it's trendy or it's something that we just need to tick that box and consider it done. Wait until there's the appetite there to do it properly, because if you do it and you get it wrong and you choose not to go back to it, you hamper the prospects of the person that might follow that genuinely does want to invest in it.